past is never past. The past we descend from becomes embedded, carved into us by the stories our families narrate. Names, places, events. What story did your family narrate? In my case, first came my mother's memory as a child during the war. The bread baked in the night and given to the partisans, hiding in the woods around the family farm. How those people suffered from fighting against the fascists. How the Germans would come in the morning to check the area. How they never touched the oven, still warm from the night shift. Then came the stories of the partisans' families, their fear of ending up in the prison of the Rijarna. Sometimes my mother would remember the weeks spent in the refugees camp in Trieste. How her sister remained in the Rijarna refugee camp for a while. How they used to dream of finding a good job, of building a better life. Her stories would usually start with a family hiding in the forest. The father was a Slav freedom fighter, hunted by the Italian fascists. Nature would always help and bring light. And mother would always promise a better time, a bright future awaiting the child there, on the other side of the bridge. In the stories my mother told me, the girl was courageous. She knew how to hide from the monsters hunting her people. I do not remember exactly when I started to be aware of the Rijarna as a Nazi concentration camp. To me, the Rijarna was the dreaded police camp where the people fighting against the fascists were taken. Before that, there had been other camps, but the hostages were the same. Young men, mothers, fathers, children, old people. And there they died. As a little girl, I would imagine the huge sight and repeat the story, but I would survive it. I would walk out of the Rijarna on the 1st of May when the partisans of Tito entered it. A partisan girl would smile at me, proud. I would smile right back, free. It was only much later that I discovered who those monsters were and what they did in the Rijarna. Globoznik left Lublin in September 1943 and took with him to Trieste a group of 92 to 102 men, SS and Ukrainians who had been under his command in Operation Reinhard in Poland. These included Wirth, the inspector of the death camp of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, Stangl, the commander of Sobibor and Treblinka, and Herring, the commander of Belzec. They were all engaged in anti-partisan activity. As in Trieste, anti-Jewish actions were not to overshadow the anti-partisan repression. The newly created Nazi German district was formed out of the territory which were under fascist Italian control until 1943. They included Italian, Slovenian and Croatian territories. Its capital was Trieste. They found in the former rice mill of San Sabba, built in 1898, the perfect establishment to set up the Rijarna, how I came to know it. Its real name was Polizeihaflager or Stalag 339, and it was set up as a police detention camp. In Italian, it is known as Risiera di San Sabba. But let us start from the beginning. This was a rice mill. It fed people. Here the logo, registered in 1901. At the time, Trieste belonged to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and it was its major and unique port. The city was multi-ethnic, multicultural, and busy in any commerce you can imagine. Business stretching from Trieste to Istanbul and the Americas. After the First World War, the city was given to Italy. The mill went out of business in the 1920s, and the site accommodated Italian police barracks. Under Globoznik, the site's main function was the detention, interrogation, and execution of thousands of anti-fascist partisans and affiliated. They were cremated in the factory's furnace, transformed into a crematorium by Lambert. The establishment also served as gathering post, slave labor workshop, and transfer station for the Jews rounded up in Venice, the Balkans, and Trieste. Who left was deported to Dachau, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen. The German anti-partisan operations rendered more effective the already large fascist repressive system. Formed by different police units and the famous Banda Colotti, which exercised extreme torture practices at various locations. Villa Triste, the Gesuiti, the Coroneo prison, and more. Thousands were killed, thousands were interned in the Italian concentration camp first, and then the Germans. With the arrival of the Nazis, things changed, but only in intensity. Often, the anti-partisan actions followed a routine established by the Italian fascists. It included the burning of villages, the arrest of the inhabitants, and arbitrary executions of people guilty of anti-fascist activities. And as the Germans helped the Italians in the fight against the partisans, more villages were burned and more people died, and those who escaped often hid in the forests. The children would be scared of the monsters and the unspoken doom, the Rijarna. They would tremble and wait for their parents to return. They would be devastated when the news came that father or mother or brothers and sisters were shut in the cells of the Rijarna. Then, one day, they were gone. The warehouses were empty of the looted goods, the garage destroyed, the crematorium dismantled, the long chimney collapsed. The cells were open, the camp deserted. Some men were still hanging around, unidentified. Who were they? Do they look worried or relieved in these photos? Then people came to look at the forbidden yard, at doom, tamed, Underground, a few fought to collect evidence, among them Albin Bubnic, a Slovenian journalist from the Primorski Dnevnik. It is his archive that today reveals to us some of the names and faces of those who died in the Riviera di San Sabba, the Rijarna. In 1945, to the Anglo-American government, Trieste mattered for a whole new reason. The mounting fight against communism and the Cold War were on. Others had to fill the rooms of the Rijarna, and crimes were put aside. New geopolitics took priority. Those closed in the Rijarna were coming from the east of Europe, from the Second World's countries. They were refugees from communist and socialist countries, and therefore they needed to be checked on their absolute anti-communist feelings. And so they were. Layer after layer, the children formed other memories, enacted other stories. The Rijarna came to symbolize something else, a new beginning, the hope for a better life. But the severity of what happened to the Jewish population of Europe won the stage. At the beginning of the 1960s, the survivors took steps to remember the victims. Soon, the Holocaust became the organizing principle for the remembrance of the Second World War. Trieste, there were thousands of Jews passed to reach Nazi camps, found in this set of tropes a ready-made narrative to be applied to the memorialization of the Rijarna. After a long stint, in 1975, the site would become a museum in remembrance of the Holocaust, in line with many other different camps. Clean up, reshaped, reduced. The site became an empty shell. Time passed, and the structure blended into the landscape of a new era. The signs of everyday life, supermarkets, shops, and traffic encircle the site. I am eager to see the new exhibition. It introduces something never seen before on this site. Information on the period after the First World War, when Italy annexed the area, proceeded with a forced Italianization of the Slav indigenous population, and opened concentration camps for Slavs. This will certainly give context to the function of the Rijarna as part of the anti-partisan Italo-German campaign. One narrative is clear and justified here. This was a camp where Jewish people were detained.
Io sono arrivato qui il 17 aprile 1944, arrivai insieme a una ventina di persone, qui venivamo dal Sushak e ci portarono attraverso quella porta su al terzo piano.
Al terzo piano chi ci stava?
Al terzo piano ci stavano i prigionieri ebrei, quelli che venivano poi trasportati in Germania. Al secondo piano c'erano quelli sospetti politici e a noi poi, quelli che ci hanno trattenuto qui, ci fecero lavorare al primo piano dove avevano installato un laboratorio di sartoria e calzoneria.
Quanto stetti in questo laboratorio?
E io sono stato in questo laboratorio quasi un anno.
The exhibition displays the model of the museum, but also the reconstruction of how the site was between 1943 and 1945. It also makes clear that 25,000 Jews passed through the Riviera di San Sabba and were moved to other camps. Of them, about 1,000 died on this site. However, there is no testimony or evidence that in San Sabba the prisoners wore uniforms. Neither were they tattooed. I am confused. Where is the story I grew up with? Where are we? What about our past? And what about those unable to mourn their people publicly? Is it because of the sentence? There was a trial in 1976. There a distinction was made between the so-called innocent victims and the guilty victims. It was acted out from the investigation onwards. This point has been one of the most controversial aspects of the trial because the sentence was pronounced only for the crimes of killing and cremating the Jewish people who died here. Were the family of partisans not innocent victims? Were the Slavic hostages not innocent victims? What is this wish to make this site completely affiliated to the extermination camps for Jewish people? What is this telling us today? Is this the only way this place can have an identity? Is this the only way Italy is able to recognize its existence? On the 10,000 pages of archival material, the exhibition brings us back to the indigenous Slavic people and their fight with an extract from a film recorded at the time of the trial. Albin Bubnic, in one single sequence, does a much better job than I have done so far.
Un altro biglietto con una carta di un quaderno o qualcosa lì dalla risiera, mandato a casa sua, singolizza nelle mani di Pacco, e scrive la lettera alla mamma: Draga mama, sporočam ti da jaz sem danes poklican za me ustreliti, torej z Bogom za nekaj, za vekomaj. Draga mama, z Bogom, draga sestra, z Bogom, dragi tata, z Bogom. Smrt fašizmu, svoboda narodu, pace zorko. La traduco. Cara mamma, ti comunico che oggi mi hanno chiamato per uccidermi. Quindi addio per sempre. Cara mamma, addio. Cara sorella, addio. Non la so. No, refrigerante.
Is silence able to delete the past? I go looking into the archive. There must be evidence. Since 1947, the Berlin Document Center held the key to yet another layer of this story. In accordance with Himmler's plan, Lobojnik was in charge of the ethnic cleaning of the entire European eastern segment. Yes, because in Trieste he was known with his original name, Globojnik, an Austrian with Slavic name. His work comprised the killing of the Jewish population and the deportation of the Slavic population. In Trieste, between 1943 and 1945, the mission was similar but driven by the battle against the very well-organized Banditen, the partisans and extended Slavic population. The deportation of the Slavic population to make room for Aryans from Italy had started already in 1942, before the arrival of the Germans. The Italian plan was put at risk by the strong resistance of the local population, supporting the freedom fighters and trying to defend themselves. Himmler transferred his protégé, Odilo Globojnik, to Trieste because he needed somebody with the right experience and an understanding of the fight against the Slovenians. Odilo had experienced it immediately after the end of the First World War, when his family had been forced to move away from the newly formed Austrian-Yugoslav border. Most of the men in charge in Trieste and the northeastern part of present-day Italy had experienced first-hand clashes with the Slovenians on the border created in 1918. They all nurtured a great dislike for the Slavic population. Once in the operational zone of the Adriatic littoral, Ludwig Kübler, military commander, and Odilo Globojnik, SS commander, exercised great brutality against the Slavic population under the supervision of the High Commissioner Friedrich Rainer. To this was added the clearing of the remaining Jewish presence. Studies show that 22 train carried Jews departed from Trieste under Italo-German rule. As for the Slavic population, the numbers of the killed varies between 3,000 and 15,000. Does this count? The point is that the Riviera di San Sabba was not an isolated German camp for Jews. It was the zenith of a process of systematic persecution and terror at the expense of the local population that was only perfected with the help of the Nazis. The rest, terrible and horrifying as it was not the point of the mission. It was the collateral consequence, as no Jew was let alone in any German territory. Is it possible the curators forgot it? Is this a matter of marketing?
Cosa c'era in questo sacco? Il sacco è scritto polvere. Signor Furla, cosa trova? Questo vedi, questo è il risultato della pratica. Sono tutti anneriti e bianchi perché sono stati bruciati, vero? Sì.
Like burn bones. Pick the identity you like here. Everything is between these walls. But really, it is not. Is identification with one grand narrative justified? Is it necessary? Is there just one way? Was the trial pointless? Was it pointless because it failed to bring to jail two men? Was it pointless because it was based on one single idea that divided the innocent from the guilty out of an ideological mindset belonging to the Cold War? So now, what do we do about it? A concentration camp? A refugee camp? A dwelling of monsters, as my mother told me. Inhabit a place like this as best as you can.